to go ahead and get started. It is 12:01 and welcome to our second quarter Poultry Lunch and Learn. Today is the first time we've offered this for small flock and backyard poultry. There we go. I was distracted by the chat box. I'm sorry. So my name is Abby Schuft. I'm an extension educator for poultry. My primary area of expertise is in biosecurity, and I work a lot with our commercial poultry farms in the state. And with me today, I also have my colleague Wayne Martin, if he wants to give a little wave. And he is our alternative livestock extension educator. And he works a lot with our backyard poultry flocks and small flock owners. So I invited him today to help deliver the small flock webinar.
All right, so we're set. Well, hello folks. Thank you, Abby, for organizing this event and putting it all together. Greatly appreciated. And thank you everybody for joining us. As we go through this, certainly if you have questions, post them. And after today, if you still have questions, why please feel free to contact either of us. This is my contact information here at the University of Minnesota, marty067@umn.edu. And that's my phone number as well. So today we're going to be talking about backyard poultry welfare, which essentially means taking care of the animals so that they don't just survive, but thrive. So I want to start first of all by talking about backyard poultry and what that really means. And it is in many ways an arbitrary definition. The U.S. Department of Ag, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service created the definition, and for them, essentially, birds with outdoor access are in a backyard operation, whether it's a hobby or a commercial operation. So for example, back in 2015, there was the avian influenza outbreak that occurred on the West Coast and eventually in the Midwest, and it had a huge impact on egg production. But on the West Coast, most of the farms that were hit were considered backyard operations. Birds had outdoor access. One of the farms was a pheasant farm with 6,000 birds. So that gives you an idea of some of the scale involved in this. And I do wish that they would separate urban backyard production from commercial pastured operations, but they have been unwilling to do that so far, but they're clearly distinct operations. So we're starting to, I guess, first of all, if we're going to talk about welfare, animal welfare, we need to consider the 5 freedoms as a basis for interpreting or defining what that really is. And the 5 freedoms came about in 1965 in Great Britain. An animal welfare organization there created the 5 standards, the 5 freedoms, and it was adopted then by the Association of Shelter Veterinarians for Companion Animals. It's also been embraced by the American Veterinary Medical Association. And it just simply is, they are standards of care that affirm that every living being's right to humane treatment, that they have that right to humane treatment. So what are they? First of all, freedom from hunger and thirst. They need to have a clean water and a well-balanced, nutritious diet. Freedom from discomfort, which can actually mean a lot of different things. But for this current definition, that covers shelter. And as you can see, a lot of these will overlap with each other. They all go together to make a one whole picture of well-being for the animal. So freedom from discomfort, which is shelter, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, which means essentially it includes proper medical care, but it also requires a lot of preventative actions on the part of the owner. Freedom to express normal behavior, including exercise and a variety of other activities. freedom from fear and distress, which we can interpret as having love and understanding of the animals, but certainly if we don't have love for them, it's hard to love animals that are in a commercial operation. It's always difficult to become attached to animals if they're going to be sold. But certainly we can understand what their needs are, what their behaviors require. So we can always work on improving our understanding of birds. So freedom from thirst, as part of that first definition. They always need access to clean water and a well-balanced, nutritious diet. But water is key for all living things. It's part of the bird's, all their metabolic or bodily functions. And it can have a, lack of water intake can have a really negative effect on the birds. It'll reduce their feed intake. It can cause flock health issues. It will slow their growth. It will reduce their egg production. So making sure that the birds always have access to clean water is essential and in great supply. So many of you, if you haven't done so already, you'll be ordering and receiving chicks, whether layers or broiler chicks. And so they'll come from a hatchery, and they can survive about 3 days after leaving the egg because they absorb all the liquid inside the egg and it's full of nutrients. So that keeps them going, but they get weaker each day without food and water. And they do need both. As soon as they arrive at your farm or your house, but they definitely need a drink of water first and foremost. So when they arrive, you should always dunk their beak in water so that they'll begin to drink immediately. Once you introduce them to water, they'll sit there and drink and drink and drink. And then gradually they will discover feed. So if you're getting a number of chicks, you should have at least a gallon of water for each 50 chicks. You can put, especially if they've been in transit for 3 days, you probably should put electrolytes or sugar in the water just to help perk them up. It'll give them a bit of energy and help them explore the environment so that they can find the food. Now, Abby, regarding questions, should we wait until the end to answer the questions or go through them as they pop up?
I was gonna wait until the end.
Okay.
Some of them I can dig up now and I will answer in the chat box.
Okay, good.
Yep. So there's lots that are kind of random. So we'll talk about them at the end. But I go ahead and answer or put them in, submit your questions, and then we'll go back through at the end.
So freedom from hunger. Chickens are omnivores, so they eat seeds, which essentially is grain. That means oats, wheat, barley, corn, soybeans. That also includes grass seed and a variety of other seeds that they can find on the landscape. They'll eat forage, grasses, weeds, legumes, meat. They will eat mice, frogs, snakes. They'll eat other chickens to some extent, and bugs. So they eat a wide variety of foods, but they will always do best on a balanced feed ration, one that is designed for their appropriate age or stage of life. And so you must remember that broilers require, for example, a different balanced feed than do layers. And for each one, at different stages of life, they require a different ration. So people like to have birds out roaming around on pasture or in their backyard, and the birds do explore the environment. They do hunt, and they will eat grubs. They'll eat some grass and some grass seed, that kind of thing. But realistically, birds get, well, estimates are anywhere from 5 to 20% of their nutritional needs from foraging on the landscape. But if you ask experts about this and really kind of pin them down, most will probably say only about 5% of their nutritional needs can be met that way. And part of the reason for that is, of course, that insect populations and forage quality and quantity both vary over the course of the year. So early in the spring, you're not going to have a lot of bugs. The forage may be good at that point and not so good later on. Later on, there'll be more bugs, but not necessarily enough to take care of the bird's nutritional needs. So when you have the birds out roaming around, just remember that they still do need a balanced feed ration. I've seen people try to cut back on giving them balanced feed and try to make them forage more, and that always ends negatively. They just don't do as well. They don't grow as well, and it cuts back on egg production. So when the chicks arrive, make sure that they have adequate feeder space so that they can all eat at the same time. They tend to do that as a group. So when chicks arrive, they need about a half a square foot per bird at that day, and more as they grow. So for baby chicks, if you had 100 of them, provide 2 1-gallon waters and about 100 inches of feeder space per 100 chicks. Now, of course, as they grow, you need to add more feeder space because they do take up room, and they do all like to eat pretty much at the same time. Freedom from discomfort, and for the we're considering this to be shelter at this point, but there's of course a variety of types of discomfort. But they need a clean space, especially the young chicks when they first arrive. They need a warm, draft-free environment, and yet one that is well ventilated, because you don't want to build up of moisture. You don't want to build up of ammonia in the room. And so you want to be using wood shavings, which are probably the best to use. Sawdust is okay, but birds can actually inhale it to some extent, and so that can be an issue for them. Straw really doesn't absorb very much, but if you have an abundant supply of cheap straw, you can just keep adding it on a regular basis, and it will help cover up the wet and reduce the odor and reduce the amount of ammonia in the air and the moisture. But wood shavings really do work quite well. So given that the chicks just came out of an egg that was incubated at around 90 degrees, they still need that for the first week of life, 90 to 95. And then as with each week, you lower the temperature about 5 degrees per week until 4 weeks of age, when they are mostly fully feathered. And then they can do quite well, in that 70-degree range. If it was, significantly colder, like in the wintertime, you would still probably want to have some supplemental heat for the birds. In the summer, after 4 weeks of age, in warm weather, the birds don't really need extra heat. And in order to provide heat, you should use an infrared or an incandescent heat bulb. Infrared only heats warm, living tissue. So the birds have to be under it to get that effect. Whereas incandescent heat bulbs actually heat the air in the room. So there is a difference in that regard, and you need to be aware of that. You should have the feed and water all set up for when they arrive as well. And again, dunk their beak in water. That way they'll find the water and continue drinking, and then begin to explore looking for food. And birds explore their environment by pecking. And so they're going to be pecking at The wood chips, they'll be pecking at everything, and they will follow you around looking for mom. So I just mentioned the heat lamp. One thing about heat lamps is you have to be careful. They can be a fire hazard, so you always want to make sure that you have it well secured, about 18 inches or so above the bedding, at least, in order to not have the bedding catch on fire, and in order to yet have it be warm enough for the birds. And it's probably good to have 2 lamps just in case one burns out. And the heat lamps do require porcelain sockets. Make sure they're using the right socket for the heat lamp. Here's an example of a brooder. A brooder is simply a way to provide that heat space for the birds in a large setting. If you had a small room with just a handful of birds, you could just use a heat lamp without having an actual brooder like this. But you can see that this works well for large numbers of birds. This is how we raise birds in the summertime on the University of Minnesota campus in St. Paul. We raise broilers on a student organic farm, and they're there. We do 2 batches. We do about 600 birds each summer. And these huts are moved on a daily basis. So this is obviously works well for late spring, summer, and early fall. But in Minnesota, with our harsh winters, we could not keep birds in this kind of a setting. It would just be too rugged, too cold for them. And we do get severe storms in Minnesota. And so on occasion, we've had huts be wiped out. And so that's why after a severe storm, we build huts that are much heavier and more solid, and they can take strong straight line winds. And you need to have that consideration as well for your operation. So it's important to remember that there is a thermoneutral zone for warm-blooded creatures, and that is the range of environmental temperatures that they can survive in comfortably and maintain their body temperature at a comfortable level. So for chickens, that thermoneutral zone is between 60 and 75 degrees. What that means then is when it goes over 75, the birds may start to eat less, just simply because the process of eating and digesting the food creates heat, and it warms the birds up and they feel uncomfortable. So you will see birds eat less during really hot weather. Conversely, when it gets below 60, birds will start to eat more to keep warm, and because they're burning up energy to stay warm. And certainly not as much as, if it gets just below 60, say down to 50, that's not so bad. But when it begins to get down around 30 or less, then the birds do really need a lot more feed in their diet in order to supply them the energy they need to keep warm. So remember that birds are warm-blooded, and without protection, they suffer in the heat and cold, as do we. In extreme weather, like extreme cold in Minnesota, we don't let our children necessarily go outside for the whole day. And if we do, they're covered, well protected. And I think that's the same kind of thing we need to consider for birds. The birds may have a desire to be outside for a while, and that can be fine, but letting them out for any great length of time, like the whole day, can result in frostbite or pneumonia or other diseases, which it's just not worth it. So we do need to keep in mind that birds should be better. They're like us. They do suffer in hot and cold weather. So, and just here's an example. And this is where, people want to let birds out and exercise and roam freely and all of that, but it can be overdone in cold weather. And so this bird has lost a foot, as you can see down in the right, all the claws are missing off the right foot. From frostbite. And sometimes the comb of a bird, not so much on this one because it's got a lot of feathers, but a comb can get severely frostbitten, and then it needs to be treated in order to help the bird recover. But what the individual owner of this bird found was that he did a little hunting around and found that it was possible to make a foot from a 3D printer. So he contacted the University of Minnesota, and somebody within the U made him an artificial foot for the bird. He had, and you can see it right there. The reason he discovered this while looking online, and he found this done at a university in Canada. So this bird had both artificial feet made after suffering from frostbite. So obviously there are ways that we can fix these kind of things, but it's better to just prevent it. So in extreme cold weather, don't let the birds go outside for very long. Let them out for a bit, but not necessarily for the whole day. They can suffer from it, and you would regret that. So freedom from pain, injury, and disease. So first of all, you want to make sure that your environment for the birds is a safe environment, that there are no sharp objects like nails sticking through the wall or pieces of wood that have a sharp edge on them or anything like that where a bird could get cut. You want to make sure also that there is enough space for birds to live in comfortably. For example, and this is a difference, for broilers, they actually only need about 1 square foot of living space. And the reason being that by the time they get to be big enough to where they're filling that space, they go off to market. But there is a difference between broilers and layers. And layers typically inside a hut require 3 to 4 square feet per bird as a minimum. And that does not include a run space outside. In that run area, you should allow about 10 square feet per bird. So there is a difference in how you handle, in terms of space, broilers and layers. You want to check your birds regularly for any sign of disease, such as pneumonia or diarrhea or parasites. Something I didn't include here, but actually mites and lice can be a real problem for birds, in particular layers that are kept around for a while. And mites and lice can take a real toll. They can suck blood and they can eventually kill a bird from anemia, but they also can reduce egg production significantly. So observation is key in all of this, spending time with your animals, just looking at them to know how they're doing. And if you do find something, you need to seek medical advice as soon as you can. So freedom to express normal behavior. Certainly exercise is important depending on the breed. For broilers, the standard Cornish cross, the bird that we buy in the grocery store, has been bred over time to just pretty much eat and grow. So they don't necessarily exercise a whole lot, although there is a variety of Cornish cross broiler that will get out and exercise more than the standard bird. But other birds have been bred for, meat birds have been bred for slower growth, for having bigger legs, and they're more active and they do like to get out and roam. And the same with layers. Laying hens like to get out and explore an area and very quickly become bored if they're just shut inside a hut all the time. So they do need to get out and explore an environment as best they can and as best that works for you with the space that you have. You want to provide a dust bath or an area that they can dig up and create a dust bath. Birds do that for a reason. They use the dust bath to kind of cover themselves with dust and dirt, and that cuts down on the mite population. And also, in hot weather, they will dig into the ground and just kind of lay there to feel the cool, that the ground is cooler than the air. And so it will help them get rid of some of the heat in their body when it's really hot. So in an urban setting, an enclosed run outside the hut will give the birds protected space for exercise. Most animal control units in most cities will require that you have an enclosed run of some sort, or it could even be your backyard as long as it's enclosed. But you can't just keep the birds inside a small hut all the time, in particular layers. They will get bored and want to be out. In a pasture setting, birds will certainly roam, in particular the ones that have been bred for pasture settings. So you can essentially free range birds, or a lot of people now use movable huts, as do we on the St. Paul campus. The movable huts kind of protect the birds from the environment, storms, also from predators. We have a lot of predators on the St. Paul campus. We also are able to control their feed intake to some extent. We want to make sure they're eating a balanced feed ration as much as possible. So we keep them in those huts and move them on a daily basis, and they are on a field of Dutch clover. So they look forward to moving every day, and they do nibble on the fresh clover. They love that, and they explore the environment within the confines of the hut. So they get plenty of fresh air, fresh forage, and some exercise, but not as much as if they were free ranging. So freedom from fear and distress, and this is a complicated one as well. There are kind of inherent contradictions in all of this, because you want the birds to express their natural behaviors, but some of it isn't pleasant. So we need to understand that and deal with it as best we can. So birds will establish a pecking order. That's where that term came from. And they can be nasty with each other, and birds can get injured. So you want to make sure, first of all, that you have enough space in the hut or in the environment that they're in to allow birds to escape constant punishment from the dominant birds. And that's where you also want to make sure that you have plenty of feeder space and plenty of water space, so that those birds that are lower on the pecking order can get access to food and water. If you find birds that have been injured from fighting, you should really separate them from the flock, if you can do so, in order to give them time to heal. Because to the extent that they maybe have even some blood that they're, if they're bleeding, that the smell of blood will draw birds to them, and they'll go after them. So, and just keep at it, pecking on them until they, are really seriously injured. So if you do have birds that are seriously injured, you should really euthanize them as soon as you can in order to reduce the suffering of the birds. And this is where this whole conflict or contradiction of ideas about freedom for the birds, freedom to let them run, and yet the risk inherent in being out in nature. We have hawks on campus, on the St. Paul campus. We have coyotes, foxes, raccoons. They all harass the birds, but the worst are the hawks. This bird I found with much of its breast meat eaten off, and I picked it up thinking it was dead, but in fact it was still alive. And so I, of course, had to euthanize it right away. And this is where nature is cruel. Nature can be really cruel. And so that's one of the aspects of raising animals that you have to be prepared to deal with. If you have birds outside, you will probably lose a few to predators. So that's, as I just mentioned, freedom versus safety against, the predators and weather. You can lose birds in storms. As we, with the slide that I showed you, where the birds were, where the storm had destroyed the hut, and we had just that one lone bird out on the hut. We actually had about 100 birds at that time out in the huts, and we got them all inside. They were still alive, but half drowned. And out of 104 birds, we saved 102. And we found that bird the next morning. But so the idea of freedom versus safety, is something of a contradiction. Freedom versus production efficiency, because when birds are out roaming around, not eating a balanced feed ration, they grow slower and they produce fewer eggs. And then, of course, there's the economic factor that you have to deal with, if whether in an urban backyard setting or a commercial operation. There are inefficiencies involved, and so that affects the bottom line. Raising birds will cost you more. So just a review, these are kind of a summary notes from some of the things we've discussed. Flock well-being regarding housing, they need adequate space, ventilation, and that ventilation is always feels like a contradiction as well, because the space should be draft free, and yet you want an exchange of air because you don't want moisture buildup, you don't want ammonia buildup in there. Sufficient lighting. Birds need, layers need about 14 hours a day of light in order to lay eggs. And broilers, meat birds, likewise, 12 to 14 hours of light, they'll continue eating much of the day. You always want to make sure that you're cleaning up around for the birds, adding fresh bedding, cleaning up around the waterers, because that area can get wet, the bedding can get wet, and then it will start to smell and produce ammonia. And so you want to get it out of there on a regular basis. Protection from weather, predators, and of course, plentiful access to feed and water. So here were the space requirements for small breeds or broilers inside a hut. 3/4 of a square foot up to a square foot. And that's in particular for broilers, just simply because they go to market quickly. And so about the time they get uncomfortable with each other, they're gone. Whereas for the layers, 3 to 3.5 square feet per bird inside the coop. Then, of course, for the layers, you'll need that hut space or that run space in the backyard, 10 square feet or so per bird. Ventilation, I've kind of covered that, but just essentially, you want to remove the moisture and the ammonia and carbon dioxide, get rid of the stale air. A damp floor or ammonia smell means ventilation is inadequate. So that's kind of the key. If you can smell it, the birds are much more sensitive to it than we are. So you need to realize that and clean it up as soon as possible. A vent or a door can work. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but you just have to have some air movement. And that, I think, is it for the time being. So.
All right, thank you, Wayne. We have a lot of questions coming in. Okay. I am going to start with the Q&A box first. So the first question that I want to get to is, what is the upper limit to birds for a small scale for chickens or other fowl? And at the very beginning of the webinar, I was busy digging that information up. There's basically two definitions the USDA sort of uses for small scale. One of them has to do with how much money you make in a year if you are selling that product, and that's $1,000. So if you're selling chicks, or you're selling eggs, or you're selling the meat of the birds, they consider you to be a commercial operation if you are earning more than $1,000 a year. As far as the actual number of birds goes, it's actually a very, very large number of birds before they consider you a large scale operation. And the definitions that I have and that I use in my work frequently is 75,000 table egg layers, or 25,000 upland game birds or waterfowl birds. For the meat birds with broilers, it's 100,000. So even though a farm might have 5,000 broilers, they're still considered small scale.
Mm-hmm.
But in our eyes, that's actually a lot of work, right? It's not what we would think of small scale, but according to the USDA, that's a small scale operation. So their numbers, their upper limit numbers, are actually quite plentiful. So with that, there's your answer. Wayne, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just agree with that. The upper limit of is kind of an arbitrary figure, but so given that the really, really large scale operation, they're raising hundreds of thousands of broilers a year, or hundreds of thousands of layers, then to have 20 or 25,000 broilers in a summer or in a year is small scale still.
Yep.
in the eyes of the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yep. So
But,
this is calendar year. Just remember that. So your
Yeah.
annual production for your calendar year.
Yeah.
Yep.
But to us, 25,000 would be a lot of birds, and it would require extra labor and all kinds of things that go with it. It'd be really complicated to do in a pasture setting.
Yep. The other question I want to be able to address is when you were talking, Wayne, about having some of the birds that were needing to be euthanized because of some predator pressure.
Mm-hmm.
How did you euthanize the injured birds? Is one of the questions.
So there are two ways to do it. If you have it handy, carbon dioxide can be used. That's considered a humane treatment, and you simply have a carbon dioxide tank and put them in a bucket and put a lid on it with a little hole and run a tube through, and you can do carbon dioxide, and it will kill them very quickly, instantly practically. Mm-hmm. Then of course the other way, if you're in a field setting and don't have carbon dioxide, is cervical dislocation. And that is also considered a proper way to do it, provided that you know how to do it. And
I was going to say that too, is providing you know how to do it properly. Yeah. If you don't, I wouldn't suggest trying it.
It can be difficult depending on the size of the bird. Yeah. The bigger they are, the stronger the neck, and so it can be tougher to do it, but it can be done. So, and certainly for the sake of the bird, getting them out of their misery as quickly as possible is really important.
Yep.
But yeah, on that bird, I did cervical dislocation because it was really in bad shape.
And it's small, and you can do that. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question about which species can and should not, what can and cannot be kept together. For example, ducks and chickens, guinea fowl, turkey, quail. What kind of birds can and can cohabitate well?
Chickens and ducks all seem to do well with guinea fowl. Guinea hens actually can be a kind of a protector bird for the group, because they will very quickly notify everybody if there's a hawk or another predator nearby. They make a lot of noise. In fact, people do complain that they can be really noisy. Birds that don't do so well together are chickens and turkeys. I would just say that it's not that they don't do well, but they can pass disease back and forth between chickens and turkeys. So probably they should be kept separate. Plus they also, I guess with any of these species, they do have different nutritional needs. And so ideally, it's better if you can keep them separate, or have places where they can go to eat separately from the other birds, because they do have different needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, I think that was a question Will asked.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Will, if you want to expand on that, reach out to us via email. The other open question that is in the Q&A has to do with providing the wire run and about what's more secure, to create an apron that sticks out at ground level or to dig the wire straight down into the ground. And maybe this is something we could address privately. I don't know, maybe according to this person's situation.
Well, I guess one thing I would say right off the bat is that the wire that will go around the run at the bird level should not be chicken coop wire. The reason being that a raccoon can reach through the chicken coop wire and grab a bird and pull feathers out. It won't necessarily kill the bird, but it'll do some damage. A hawk can reach through with its beak and tear off flesh, and then you may end up having to euthanize the bird. So about 3 feet up from the ground, we use hardware cloth that you can get at any, like Home Depot or Menards, and hardware cloth has really small gaps in it so that nothing can get through it. And we use hardware cloth that is 3 to 4 feet in height. So definitely have that. And then I would say that depending on the predator population you have in your area, it may be worthwhile to bury wire in the ground, just simply because some creatures will dig in. We've never had a coyote or a fox or a raccoon dig under our huts in the field, in part because the Dutch clover is so thick that we've seen where they've tried it and they just give up. It's not worth digging there. So
is it just because the root structure is so thick? Yeah, it's too much work.
Too much work. They go elsewhere for something, another meal.
I think this is a really good opportunity also, Wayne, to let folks that are still watching know that we were planning to offer another webinar in June about predators. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is something we can go into more depth during, is protecting from predators in some of these urban and rural settings. So there's a plug. Watch our YouTube channel, not the YouTube channel, the Facebook page, and also the Small Flock listservs that Wayne participates in. So watch in the coming weeks for an announcement about that topic webinar.
I would also add that we have a listserv at the University of Minnesota called Poultry, and we send out notices about upcoming workshops and just notices that are important to the small flock community, whether they're urban or small-scale commercial.
Great. I'm going to start scrolling through the Q&A here. Lots of good comments about experiences they've had dealing with contaminated feed, contaminated commercial feed. One comment that chicks will tell you whether they're cold or they're too hot. Mm-hmm. And they so kind of watch their behaviors.
They will do that in the sense that if you have a heat lamp in the room, if they're really warm, they won't lay directly underneath the heat lamp. But if they are cold, they'll bunch up underneath it. Likewise, if you don't have a heat lamp, they will pile up on each other to try to get warm.
And then I'm going to leave with one final question, one discussion point before we log off, and thank you all for joining us. Bill asks, what do you think of fresh air poultry houses that were developed in the early 20th century? They recommend open air housing even into winter. And I remember the reason had to do with the concern for the ammonia buildup. And as you mentioned, Wayne, if you can smell the ammonia, the birds are definitely affected as well. So he says he has tried the open air poultry house and the birds do seem to like it. So do we have any other input for the audience about that?
I guess I would say that, you know, an open air unit in the wintertime it all depends on the kind of winter you have. Like in Minnesota, we have really severe winters. So having an open air facility on a winter night when it gets 20 below, I just don't think would be a very good idea. You don't want that much fresh air. It would be detrimental to the birds. But in a climate that has a milder winter, an open air facility could work.